So let's get started with formal writing strategies. When we start talking about formal writing, there are, of course, different styles of writing, and they're almost all perfectly fine when they're used where they're supposed to be used. So if you're using informal prose, which is a lot of what you've practiced, I understand, up to this point, letters, on the internet, whatever, that's fine. But as you start moving toward your BA thesis, and as you start moving away from the stuff that people wrote in high school, you start trying to do it with more strict rules, more formal style. So what I want to talk about today is what are some of those things you should be looking out for. And as I talk about it, I should warn you that there is discussion about some of these. So if you hear that if you had another professor or another teacher somewhere say, well, so-and-so said different, okay, that's fine. But I can tell you that from my background, which includes a PhD in American history, a master's degree, a native speaker, published 2 books and multiple articles in literature and history, this is what formal English generally looks like in American English. Formal style helps you mute some of the possible controversies about a topic. Because formal style is first and foremost very detached. It's scholarly. It's not something that the way you use it, it is very impersonal. And even as far as that goes, if you think about any of these controversial topics, if you have somebody who comes up to you and says, "This is what I think, and it's the opposite of what you think, and you're wrong," how are you going to react to that, as opposed to, well, there are different opinions on this subject, and here are some issues that could be considered. Yeah, one is more academic. It's not me. You're not telling me I'm wrong. So formal style is important to getting this right. Anyway, this is just an introduction to academic writing via Calvin and Hobbes. It's way more accurate than it should be. To be perfectly honest, his fake topic there, The Dynamics of Interbeing and Monological Imperatives in Dick and Jane, a study in psychic transrelational gender modes. Now, the Dick and Jane, for what this is worth, is for years, I don't know what it is right now, but for years, Dick and Jane were the very first books that Americans ever learned to read on. So when you were in your very first grammar school experience with a book, you were reading about Dick, Jane, and Spot. Spot was the dog. And it had very, very simple sentences like, "See Dick run. See Jane running with Dick." That kind of thing. And so that's what they're playing on here. Anyway, and I also give this as an example of what you're not trying to do. Some people have this attitude that the more obscure, the more difficult, the longer, the bigger the language is, the more academic it should be or could be. I disagree with that. Yes, I want you to have a very big vocabulary. I want you to use your words very well. I want you to use complex structures. At the same time, the point of writing is to communicate. The point of writing is to communicate clearly. It's not to try to make it as difficult as possible for people to figure out what the heck you're talking about. And so that's, of course, my next point. Whenever you're writing something, your style should communicate things clearly and accurately. That's what formal style does. It tries to take the emotion out of the issue as much as possible, and it tries to leave you with the straightest path to truth that you can find. Also, it helps your audience understand your discoveries. That is the purpose of writing in formal style. Excuse me. It opens your audience's eyes to what your evidence and your discoveries mean. It convinces your audience that you're correct. And I put that in italics because, again, we tend to forget about that in expository writing, because expository writing is not supposed to be argumentative. But at the same time, if you are not convincing your reader that you know what you're talking about, you've lost. So if you're not presenting your work, if you're not presenting your ideas in such a way that they're going to be able to walk away and say, I agree with that, then you've wasted your time and everyone else's. So all writing and editing decisions have to be made with that in mind. And that being the case, what are some of the things you should avoid in formal style? First, jargon and cliches. Jargon is a set of words that properly belong to a technical vocabulary, but their overuse or inappropriate use has made them silly, distracting, and pretentious. This is one of those things, remember I told you that people seem to think that the bigger, crazier, rarer words you throw into an academic piece, the more formal, the better it is. Well, that's not always true. You can think about nautical examples, and I choose that because that's the jargon that Americans are most familiar with, at least. So these are some words that to a sailor out on the high sea are going to mean one thing, but to us in here, learning standard English means something completely different. So if you mouse something, we think, oh, yeah, what you click, or the thing that eats the cheese. But in nautical lingo, it means to bind a thin line around a shackle pin to prevent it from shaking loose. So if you're going through, well, I'll do these other two first. A nautical mile, you talk about a certain nautical mile. It's a very different distance from even miles that Americans would think about. The distance along a 1 minute arc measured at the equator equivalent to 6,076 feet. I don't know why they do the odd numbers. That's one thing I will give the metric system. Everything ends in a zero. And then I like this one too, MOB. Or you look at it and you'd think mob. Wait a minute, mob? What, is a mob attacking the ship? Is this pirates? But no, it's a piece of nautical jargon that you see on emergency buttons that means man overboard. So when you look at all of those things, if you were writing a paper about something that had to do with the ocean, it would make sense to use jargon where appropriate. But if you just start sticking these words in at random places without any context, if you don't explain to people what they mean, then when people are going to walk away either having no idea what you're talking about, or they're going to look at you and they're going to think, this person is an idiot. This person, maybe they know what you mean by mouse, but because of the way you use it, it's pretty clear you don't. Anyway, so the dangers of overusing jargon is, first, it can reveal your ignorance. If you don't really know what all of these things mean, when you start using them, it just shows people you're stupid. It shows people you don't know what you're talking about. And if you use a piece of jargon wrong and people look at that and go, they don't know what they're talking about, they're going to doubt everything else that you have to say in your essay. You can also acronym your readers to death. This is something that the military in general seems to have a problem with. And I presume the Polish military would be similar. Most militaries that I've encountered use acronyms for everything. In the U.S., they talk about CONUS and OCONUS and all of these other things. CONUS means inside the continental U.S. or outside the continental U.S. And so they throw these acronyms in there like MOB that if you know what you're talking about, yeah, it makes sense. But anybody outside that context has no idea. And it just gets confusing. And in the end, it just imparts a sense of arrogant silliness. It looks like you're trying to impress people. And I don't know about you, but the very minute I realize someone is trying to impress me, it stops impressing me. Your reader is the same way. If the reader thinks you're trying to show off, it stops working. It stops impressing them. So when you're dealing with jargon, use as much as you're comfortable with, but make sure that you're using it correctly, you're using it well, and that you do not overuse it. Now, a cliche, before I put that up there, what is a cliche? Do y'all know?
Something typical.
Typical, that's good. But just being typical does not necessarily make something. There you go, exactly, overused. So cliches are cute, pithy sayings that have been so overused they aren't cute and pithy anymore. Somebody say something?
I just went for never say never.
Oh yeah, that's a bad one. There are many, and if you think about them, the very first time somebody used never say never, it was creative. It was interesting. It was something that people hadn't heard. And it was so creative and interesting that everybody started saying it. And since it has been said again and again and again and again and again, when people see never say never in something like a paper or an essay, they go, oh, this person doesn't know how to write original sentences. Now, I know again that hopefully much earlier in your English training, you were learning these kinds of idioms because they're useful in conversation. It's one thing to be chatting to somebody and say, oh well, never say never. That's perfectly normal. I use those kinds of phrases all the time in normal conversation. But your essay is not normal conversation. Your essay is supposed to be a cut above. It's supposed to be beyond that. Hey, a cut above, that's a cliche there as well. So you want to avoid them. And we talked about signposts. The main difference between a signpost and a cliche is that at least a signpost serves a purpose in the structure of your essay. So if you use the signpost in summary, at least it serves the purpose of showing that you're transitioning to your conclusion. It's still cliche, but people are not going to react to it as harshly as they would if you have a true cliche. Now, unlike jargon, you need to get the cliches out of your writing as much as possible. The problem is there are so many of them. And for you guys, sitting where you are, it's just going to take time. You're just going to, every time that you hear something new, you're going to have to try to figure out, is this cliche or is this not? And with practice and context, you'll start to pick up on them. Here are a few examples, and I say few because there literally are thousands of them out there. And I'm sure you've heard quite a few of these. All that glitters is not gold. Why don't you just kiss and make up? Only time will tell. It lasted an eternity. Just a matter of time. It's a waste of time. Had the time of his life. As ugly as sin, as weak as a kitten. And if you remind me, if somebody sends me an email, I'll post this on Moodle, so you don't have to try to write down every single one. What goes around comes around, frightened to death, scared out of his wits, opposites attract. Those are all things. And again, every time, whoever was the first person, and I think it may have actually been Shakespeare, to say, all's well that ends well. It was great. It was really interesting. But now, no, don't put these in your formal essay. I have to admit there's one that really annoys me. And I think it annoys me because it's one that y'all have been taught to use a lot, nowadays. I hate that word. And the last time I mentioned that to a class, the next set of assignments they turned in, it was nowadays, 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 nowadays. It's like, thanks, guys. Nowadays, it is cliche, but it also is too colloquial. It's really not part of the formal language. All right. Any questions about cliches?
How can you replace nowadays?
How could you replace nowadays? In recent times, you can give a specific time. You can cite according to current ideas. There are different ways of putting it in the context itself. I have to admit that I don't think I have used the word nowadays in probably a decade or two because I hate it so much. It's, and that's one of the things that obviously there are different opinions on. If you're being taught by people here to use the word nowadays, they're obviously okay with it. I'm just saying that if I were Certainly if I'm teaching this class back in the States, I would not go for nowadays in a formal essay. So, quotations. Quotations are a big part of formal writing. Because again, now your exam essays are different, but your at-home essays and your research paper have to be based on evidence. They have to be based on proof. Therefore, you have to actually cite and quote your sources. I've said it before, I'll say it again. Nobody cares about your opinion. What people care about is that you can go out and research and find proof and actually show what you're talking about is true. Everybody's got, opinions are like underwear. Everybody has them. And each person's opinion is just as good to them as their own underwear. I don't want your opinion. I don't want your underwear. Same basic idea. You got to do something more. You have to show that what you're doing is worthwhile. So, strangely enough, some people despise direct quotations. At the lower levels, you're taught basically to throw quotations in every chance you get. And that's okay. But unfortunately, sometimes direct quotations are just a crutch to lazy writing. And you know exactly what I mean, I'm sure. Some of you who are still haven't written your rough draft yet, you're going to run into this tonight. You're going to be writing on your essay and you're going to be like, I've still got 150 words to go. What do I do? Oh, I take this giant block quotation from this other source and I stick it in here. Or maybe instead of one big one, you use a whole bunch of little ones. Because every time you say, as so-and-so says and such, well, the truth is that when people read your essays, and myself included, when I read your essays, I'm actually here looking for you. I want to hear what you have to say. I don't care primarily what somebody else has to say. Now that may sound contradictory. I care about your research and I care about what you've done with it. I don't want to see just quotations of somebody else's research. I want to see your thinking and your writing. And quite frankly, if you don't give me that, you've wasted all of our time. That's what I'm here for. That's what I flew across the Atlantic for, was to hear what you have to say. So if all you do is literally string together a whole bunch of quotations and you turn into me what is a paper that is nothing but quotations or near to it, that's not good. And yes, if that sounds strange, I actually have had students turn in papers that were probably 90% quotations. Only 10% were their words, and it was the little spaces in between the quotations that said, according to so-and-so. So no, you need quotations, you need citations, but don't overdo it. Other people use direct quotations to show off their research and to drop names. So they want to show you, oh, look, I'm so smart. I've read this person's book. And so they stick this person's book in there. Or I'm so smart, look, I can cite from this person. Yeah, great. But if you're not doing more with it, all it shows is that you haven't taken the time to do it right. Anyway, so there are times when direct quotations are justified. First, when it's necessary to follow a discussion. If you're writing an essay and you need to talk about a debate between two positions, let's say you're writing about, you decide you're going to do your research paper on the history of climate change. Part of that might be talking about the debate between the people who are pro-climate change, well, not pro-climate change, they think climate change is real, and the people who think climate change is fake. Well, if you are doing that, it makes perfect sense for you to quote directly from one person who says this as opposed to the other person who says that, because we need to see what they're saying and we need to hear what they're saying. If your subject needs to speak for him or herself, if you're doing a biography of somebody, and who knows, maybe you'll do that for your research paper. Maybe you'll choose a person that you want to do a biography on. If you're doing a biography and you never actually let us hear what the person, him or herself, says, then you're doing something wrong. So we need to hear. And also, every once in a while, you come across where an author has included a particularly excellent or unique turn of phrase. And you know what I'm talking about, I'm sure. You're reading along, somebody says something, and you just laugh out loud because it's just so well put. If in those cases, sometimes you can do it too. The big thing to remember with quotations is that, first, if you can say it in your own words, do so. That's especially important for those of you sitting in this room because you're still developing your English skills. And if all you're doing is copying somebody else word for word, if you're not actually going through the trouble of trying to translate it and put it better, and I mean translate it in your head, not translate it to a different language, putting it in your words, then you're not getting half of the benefit of what you're supposed to be doing. It also means you're never going to actually improve as a writer. Next, keep your quotations short and to the point. Don't just go on and on and on and on without a very darn good reason. You want, ideally, quotations should not even be a full sentence if you can help it. There are times, of course, that you need to, and that's fine, but keep them short and to the point. Edit quotations using an ellipsis to fix extra long ones. And let me pull out my marker here, because I don't know about y'all, but a lot of Americans don't know what an ellipsis is. An ellipsis is just the 3 dots. A lot of times nowadays, there you go, you see this brackets added on the outside. What are ellipses used for? When you see an ellipsis in a quote, what does that imply?
So when you're not going to write the whole quotation and only a part of it, for instance, the beginning of it, and then you don't need the central part. You put this one, and then you need the rest of the quotation.
Exactly. What this basically does is it tells your reader that stuff is missing from here. And it's just a fair way to tell your reader that, yes, I've edited this. If you want to see the full thing, you need to go look at the original. And you can do this multiple times in a long quotation. It doesn't have to be just one time. It doesn't have to be in the middle of the quotation. It can go in the beginning of the quotation. It can go at the end of the quotation. The idea is, though, of course, yes, exactly. Let's say that you're working on something in this particular source. At the beginning of the paragraph, it says something useful to you, and at the end of the paragraph, it says something useful to you. But you got all this stuff in the middle here. Well, all this stuff in the middle, you don't need it. And the first thing I'm going to do when I'm reading your essay is I'm going to put a big red mark through it. And I'm going to say, no, you don't need this. So what do? You take all of that out and you put the ellipsis. So ellipses are very, very useful. But here is a caution about that. You have to be very, very careful, and this is a double-bladed caution. First, when you're using an ellipsis, you have to be very, very careful that you don't change the meaning of the quotation. That is a real problem. People will sometimes take something completely out of context. They'll put an ellipsis on it and say, see, I told you this was edited, but the truth is it's completely changed the actual meaning of the text. So as a good, intelligent, truthful person, you first need to make sure that you are not changing it at all. And then second, you need to make sure that as a good, truthful, intelligent person, when you see someone using an ellipsis, that you're on your guard to make sure they haven't changed it. And incidentally, sometimes, you may not know this, but sometimes you can use brackets to clarify parts of a quotation. So, and I should have thought of an example before I came here, but let's say there's something about this. You need to somehow say, this person's writing a letter, and the first part of the letter applies to what you're talking about. The second part of the letter is about their mother, and the end part of the letter is about what you're talking about too. You can put into brackets in the middle of the quotation with the ellipsis and say, the next two paragraphs talk about their mother. Or if, let's say, you're changing it to a present tense, whereas they were talking in the past tense. You can also put words in brackets. That just shows that you have edited this, you have changed this, maybe to make it more intelligible. And do people change the meaning? Absolutely. One of my favorite stories was with one of my mentors. He's actually the guy who married my wife and I, but he was a college professor I had. He was asked to review a book, and he read the book, and this is before publication. So the book had not come out yet, but he read it and he sent his thoughts back. And in his original quote, he said something to the effect of, if this book had done this, that, or the other, it would be a book not to be missed. As it is, this book wallows in mediocrity and is not a particularly good book. So the book comes out, it's published, and whenever you review a book like that, they send you one for free. So he got his copy of the book, and he looked on the back, and he was on the back cover. You're like, what? Usually you put positive things on the back cover. And he looked on the back cover, and it said, ... not to be missed, end quote. So yeah, it was the exact opposite of what the guy said. So yes, people do it. Now, if you love books, the next time you go into a bookstore, you're going to pick it up and look at the back and see something like that and wonder. But anyway, you have to be careful. Use quotations as illustrations and not proofs. Again, unless this is something that you really need the quotation as a real proof. If that's the case, great. Usually quotations should not, that are longer than 4 lines should be blocked. Now this varies a little bit based on the formatting style that you use. Now another thing that UIM does, and I don't know why they do it, but they have their own formatting style. The rest of the world uses either MLA, which is the Modern Languages Association, APA, the American Psychological Association, or Chicago/Turabian. And Chicago and Turabian are basically the same thing. But here at UIM, there's the UIM style sheet. And so that's what you're going to have to learn, and we'll go over that as we start talking about your research paper. But technically, you're supposed to do whatever your style sheet says. For Turabian, at least, if your quotation goes over 4 lines of your paper, it needs to be blocked. And so you'll have to check with the UIM style sheet, and we'll do that later to see what that looks like. That's another thing that kind of the people who are trying to make their papers longer artificially, that's another thing they'll do. Instead of using block quotes, which usually scrunch it down and keep it tight, they'll just go on with a long quote that takes up over a page sometimes. Anyway, and then integrate the quotations into your text. What this means is don't just stick a random quotation in. Make it to where it flows as part of what you're saying. So instead of sticking a quotation in there where someone says, "This is my opinion," add in a little bit that leads into it. Say, "As so-and-so remarks, his opinion is," quote, quote, quote. So that someone who's reading it doesn't just go from you to bam, here's a quotation that makes no sense to them whatsoever. And then, of course, they're supposed to transition right back to what you're thinking right afterwards. So you definitely want that in there. And one thing that helps, this will be for your research paper, not so much for this essay right now, but looking forward to your research paper, people make the mistake of believing that in order to cite a source, you must quote the source. Now, there are some notation styles that make you do that, but in general, you don't have to do that. So if you want to reference some research that you did, you don't have to put in a direct quotation from it. You put in, UIM uses parenthetical references, so you just at the end of the sentence, put in George, page 95. Or if you're using a footnoting style, you can just put in a footnote at the end of the sentence. And you can put references to whatever sources you want without having to actually quote explicitly from those sources. This is really important as you start looking at academic writing and looking at formal writing, because this is how you actually show it's not just your opinion, is by integrating these sources and integrating these ideas. And so you don't have to quote. And again, I don't know if this is something that you may have heard. I grew up hearing this. Some people say, how much should you quote? I heard you're supposed to use one quotation per page. That's absolute baloney. There are pages that will have no quotations whatsoever. But if you're doing a research paper, you should have multiple citations per page. There should not be a single page that does not have citations to something. Even if the page is entirely your ideas, you should be pointing to something where people see your evidence and your point of view, or what backs up your point of view. All right, any questions?
Do we have to paraphrase a fragment we want to talk about, or we just make a statement and we put this citation?
It varies. It varies. And a lot of it depends on how you're doing it. For example, if you think you're in danger of quoting them by accident, then make sure you paraphrase completely and well. If you can put it entirely in your own words, you don't have to paraphrase. The danger, and we'll talk more about this later, the danger with paraphrasing is plagiarizing. And plagiarizing, it can happen entirely by accident. And that's why people are worried about it. So sometimes it's an incomplete paraphrase. You're paraphrasing them and you only change a few words. Well, it's still plagiarism. If I can read what you put down, and I can, without knowing where it came from, I could see that it was exact. Well, I should rephrase that. Without you telling me where it came from, I can see the exact similarities. It's still plagiarism. Sometimes people plagiarize by accident. You've been up researching really, really late at night, for example, and you're taking notes on your subject. And it's 3 a.m, you've had your 5th pot of coffee, or if you're like a friend of mine, she used to drink Mountain Dew. 2 liters of Mountain Dew. She'd go through 3 of them in a night staying awake. She was insane. But you're on your second 2 liter of Mountain Dew, and you're just not thinking clearly. You're half asleep. Maybe you're actually dozing off. And so you're taking notes, and you write down a note, and you forget to put it in quotation marks to say that this was a quote. Well, what happens? You go to sleep. The next day, you get up, you start working on your paper again. You forget that this was a quote. You forget that this was actually something that you meant to say was a quote. It's not a paraphrase, it's a quote. And so, wow, I'm brilliant. Gee, who'd have thought I was that smart? It's a great phrasing. And so you put it in your paper. And then maybe the professor who's grading it recognizes it because they've seen it before. Or maybe it gets caught up in the plagiarism checking engine. Have I talked about plagiarism checking engines with y'all yet? Okay. I want to make sure I get through this, but do not let me forget. My experience, I may not have time today, but my experience with that is that most students live in mortal terror of the plagiarism checkers because they're convinced that these plagiarism checkers are going to destroy their academic career. Because they're going to get like a 15% similarity and suddenly they're going to fail out of university. It's not that bad. And so I do want to take the time to explain to y'all how they work and how your professor, if they're even half intelligent, which hopefully they are, they're professors, is going to use that. So I do not want to get through this term and not have talked about that. So yes, depending on the style, depending on what you're doing at that moment, you need to either choose. You can choose to paraphrase. You can choose to put it all in your own words. But I will say this: if you think there's any danger of you not being able to do it thoroughly, put it in quotation marks. In that case, it's better to overquote a little bit. So here's a big one. Use of first person singular. First person references to yourself in formal writing is a no-no. You do not do it. Now, why do you not do it? Well, first, it's completely impractical. When you use, and again, I'm talking about a formal essay. If you're writing an email, if you're writing a story, if you're doing anything else, first person, who cares? Use it if you want. But in this kind of formal writing, using I, me, my, it's completely pointless. You're wasting everyone's time. Why? Examples, I will argue that, it occurred to me that, in my opinion, blah, 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 blah. We already know all of this. How do I know this? Because you're the author of the paper. Everything in the paper is your opinion. Everything in the paper occurred to you, unless you are telling me that it came from somewhere else. So if I see a quotation, I go, oh, this occurred to someone else. But other than that, everything in the whole paper is yours. You don't have to keep constantly reminding me, oh, this is mine. Oh, that's mine too. Oh, wow, look at me. I'm smart. This is me too. It's pointless. And I will tell you that there is debate over this. I could tell I could see some of the way some of y'all were looking at each other that you've heard differently elsewhere possibly. But the people who hate first person hate it with a blinding hot passion. And the people who don't hate first person, they don't care if you use it or not. So if you're going into an essay situation where you don't know who is going to read your essay, you have a choice. You can take a risk and you can use first person, and you may get a professor who doesn't care, but you may also get a professor who's going to try to burn your paper alive for using it. On the other hand, if you don't use first person, nobody's going to notice, nobody's going to care. Or if anything, I think it actually makes your writing stronger to use to not use first person. And we'll talk about this later. But in expository writing, in argumentative writing, in all formal writing, again, it's not about you. It's not about me. It's about getting at the truth of what we're talking about. So if you keep stepping up and going, oh, yeah, me, look at me, it's me, that's me, this is my idea, you're getting in the way of what you're trying to do. So what you want to do is step back, keep it objective, and you want to keep people focused on the actual truth. Here's another really basic one. No contractions. Never use I, weird, any contraction whatsoever. Even if it feels a little awkward to you, don't use a contraction in formal prose. Remove them from your paper immediately on the first draft. And again, when you're writing the rough draft of your paper, these things slip in. They happen. But this is something that you should be going back for, looking for systematically. One thing you can do, by the way, to try. Here's another really controversial one. Passive voice. Passive voice, of course, involves having the action occur to the subject of your sentence instead of having the subject of your sentence doing the action. Why? What's the big deal? Well, for years, formal writing in the U.S. has been taught with passive voice as anathema. I actually had a professor in graduate school who would fail you for the entire paper if he found more than one passive voice in your paper. And his argument was simple, and it makes sense. It's boring. It's really bad writing when you get down to it. There are times when it's necessary. If you need to make the subject passive to make a point, great. But 90% of the time, that's not necessary. So the examples, George Washington led the army, is active. The Army was led by George Washington, passive. And I'm not going to go through every single one of those because I'm sure you've seen them before or something like them. But the thing to note about the active voice construction is that it's shorter, it's more concise, and in general, it's more powerful. So if you're trying to become a better writer, moving away from the passive voice is not a bad thing at all. I mean, try to just put yourself in their shoes, I guess. Try to imagine reading an entire paper that was sentence after sentence of, the savannah is roamed by beautiful giraffes. Is done this, is done that, is the other. If you need to use it, yes, you can use it, but be very careful with it. Overuse of was and were. This comes off sounding like passive voice, but it's not, obviously. From a grammatical standpoint, it's different. The Army was led by George Washington is passive. George Washington was leading the Army is not passive. Communicates two separate things, even though the word was is in both cases. The problem that I found, and again, I gotta see what y'all do, but for a lot of Americans, they think sticking was into a sentence is how you make it past tense. I don't know why, where they came up with that, but the end result is that every other word in their paper is was, were, was, were, was, were, was, were, was, were, was, were. And just like any other word that you use too much, it makes your paper sound bland, pointless, and repetitive. So use it when it's appropriate. If you need to denote a continuing state of affairs, the audience was applauding loudly during the politician's speech. Okay, go ahead, use it. But don't use it every single time. And even there, you can put it a different way. The audience applauded loudly as the politician gave his speech. What I have found is that people tend to overuse the words was and were so much that if you just go back and eliminate as many as you can and replace them with sentences like this, then you're much more likely to end up actually at a decent amount where you should be. Speaking for your reader. This is another big one that's just annoying. This happens when you try to dictate to your reader what he or she must think or must see. So some examples here from the evidence we see. This shows us that you can see, one can see. By the way, another one I would really suggest, try to get away from using one does anything in your writing. Because most of the time when someone puts that in there, they're either using it as a way of trying to sneak in first person, or they're trying to do something like dictate to their reader without using the exact words. The effect is the same, and it generally tends to be a sign of weaker writing. So, why not do this? Well, a lot of the times because it simply provokes an emotional response in your reader. Your reader, nobody wants to be told what they have to believe when they're reading the kinds of essays that you're writing. I mean, stop and think about it. If somebody just walked up to you out of the blue and said, you got to believe this. Even if they're right, you have that tendency to want to buck up and say, no, I don't want to do that. So it gets in the way of what you're trying to communicate. And then secondly, it's much more effective to just be convincing. If you're going to talk about the evidence for climate change or the evidence against climate change, instead of standing up in front of them and saying, one can see that climate change is true, or one can see that climate change is false, or whatever you're going to do, isn't it much better to simply say the evidence for climate change is X, Y, and Z, or the evidence against climate change is X, Y, and Z? And if you do that, if you convince people on their own, they're going to be 10 times more convinced than otherwise. If you let them make the decision instead of telling them what they have to think. Here's another one. Avoid extraneous words. Bigger and longer don't necessarily make for better writing. This is getting better now that postmodernism is finally dying. It's the slow death of nonsense. But for a long while there, The general idea, again, was that the bigger, the more convoluted, the more ridiculous sounding the word you can put into your writing, the more academic and formal it was. Yeah, well, maybe for people, no, I'm not going to say that. That'll sound too snarky. But for weaker writers, maybe that's true. But the best writers are the ones who have the vocabulary to say things powerfully and clearly at the same time. And I don't know about you, if you want to rely on a crutch, like just sticking in random giant words, I guess that's your business. But I would much rather see you go farther and become better and become stronger. The very best writers, from my perspective, they're the ones who you can pick up their writing and you can either be somebody just off the street or you could be a specialist in your area and they communicate just as effectively to both groups. Those are the people who are really gifted in writing. The ones who aren't either write like 3-year-olds or write like these people. So comb through your writing and try to find extra words that you can cut out. But again, I'm not saying dumb down your writing. Don't think I'm saying that. I'm not saying stick in a bunch of colloquialisms or cliches. I'm not saying that either. But if you find yourself using a giant word just because you can use a giant word, there's probably a better word out there that you can find to fit the bill. All right, some tips for writing clear sentences. And again, I'm not going to belabor this. Keep an eye first on tense. A major problem that I see people in all levels do, or at least all of, I should say in all regions, the U.S. and elsewhere. He went to the market and is filling up his cart. Either keep it all past tense, all present tense, all future tense, whatever. That's true of sentences. That's also true of paragraphs. Do not shift back and forth between tenses in your paragraph. Carefully observe the parts of your sentence and make sure that phrases, pronouns, and descriptions actually refer to what they're supposed to. It's possible sometimes to write a grammatically correct sentence that makes no sense whatsoever when someone reads it. So the person on duty was so shocked that they didn't know what to do. Now actually this one I should change because just within the last couple of years, this has started to soften. And I believe officially it's either Webster's or the New Oxford Dictionary, they is now accepted as a generic singular. But still, in this transition period, you may want to consider avoiding that. Because for a lot of people, it still sticks out. It still confuses them. Are you talking about a single person on duty? Or are you talking about a group of people on duty? A dry wind blew across the wretched corpse, whistling. So who's whistling? The corpse? I guess it's a cheerful, wretched corpse, if it's still whistling. And of course there it's obviously the wind, but because of the placement of the word whistling, you can't tell who it connects to. And this is a famous one that you see in a lot of grammar classes in the U.S. Walking stick lost by woman with curiously carved head. And of course, again, that's supposed to refer to the walking stick. But the way it's placed in the sentence, it sounds like you're talking about the woman having a curiously carved head. And it makes these kind of things make their way into even the best prose. I came across one that said, talking about the colonists creating furniture. The colonists with curiously, I forget exactly what it was, but the colonists creating furniture with curiously carved feet. And the way they said it, it sounded like they were talking about the colonists were carving their feet. Sounds painful. But both of these, and for this one in particular, the best thing I can say is try your best when you're editing to read things from someone else's perspective. So if you wrote that second sentence there, a dry wind blew across the wretched corpse whistling, well, of course you don't think a corpse is whistling, it's dead. So you look at that and you don't see any problem. But on the other hand, anybody else coming to the sentence is going to look at it and go, what? What are they talking about? So you have to find a way to stop and back up and think of things outside the box. Try to avoid absurdly long sentences. That's another big thing. People seem to think that the longer and more complex a sentence gets, the better it is. Now again, I'm not talking about writing absurdly short sentences, but your goal when you're writing a sentence isn't to see how long you can make it without it being a run-on sentence. Your goal when writing a sentence is to be clear about what you're talking about. So the example I have here, Mr. Johnson, a major league pitcher, found himself waiting at a small town bus stop where little Bobby, a great fan, approached him. Well, that one's even actually kind of short compared to some I've read. I've read sentences that went on for almost a page in various papers. Well, if you have to take a breath by the time you get to the end of the sentence, you can't read the whole sentence in one breath, it's too long. So you simply break it up. Mr. Johnson, a major league pitcher, found himself waiting at a small bus stop. While there, little Bobby, a great fan, approached him. It's about the same amount of space, but because you've added in that sentence break, it makes a big difference. And that gets into the mind your rhythm part. Much of what, of good prose is almost like music. When you're reading a good book or you're reading a good essay, it has a flow and a rhythm to it, just like the music that you like to listen to. And if all of a sudden you're listening along and it's got this same regular beat and somebody just out of nowhere bangs something right in the middle of it, then what does that do to you? It shocks you, it surprises you, it drives you crazy. So what you want to do is make sure that there's nothing in your writing that does that. You want good regular sentences, some shorter, some longer. I can't give you an immediate example of this right now. For one, it would take too long. And second, it's going to depend on the situation. As you're reading through it, if you're going along, and you'll see this, you're going along, it's moderate sentence, moderate sentence, moderate sentence, two-word sentence. Or moderate sentence, moderate sentence, moderate sentence, sentence that just never ends. You'll see that and you'll pick up on it. So check that out while you're editing. Now, editing. Editing turns failures into passes. All of the stuff that we just talked about, quite literally, happens in everybody's rough draft at some point or another. One of the things I always tell myself I'm going to do and then I always forget is that one of these days I'm going to save one of my rough drafts of something that I get published, and I'm going to bring it into a class like this and I'm going to show it on the screen and say, look at this garbage. Because the first time you write any draft, it's going to have issues. It's going to have problems. So it's not, people have this idea that writing you have to write a perfect first draft, that's what makes a good writer. Absolutely not. No writer that you have ever dealt with, no writer that you've ever read has ever written a perfect first draft. Now there are some that need less fixing and some that need more fixing, but they all need fixing. So if you can write a passing paper on a first draft, then you could probably get it published with proper editing. You can get it, if you could get a 3 with barely trying, then if you actually went back and edited it properly, you could get a 5+. There's no limit to what you can do. Anyway, so I just said that. Even if no obvious errors are present, you can almost nearly always find something you can fix. Every chance you have, every day, whatever you write, however far you've come along as a writer, there's always something you can learn to do better. So the hardest part of editing is seeing what you've actually written, not what you intended to write. That, and I'll pause on that one for a second because it doesn't get any harder than that when it comes to editing, because we all like to think we're intelligent people. We all like to think we write well. Fairly rarely met someone who thinks they're a complete idiot. So when you're going back and you're reading things, you don't expect it to be terrible. At least most people don't. And even if you do expect it to be terrible, what you do is you read what you think the words should say into it, not what's actually there. I do this all the time. To be honest with you, I have only recently found a reliable way to fix this problem for myself. Because what I do is I write something, and when I go back and I read it to edit it, I read a word that is spelled wrong, but since it's not, when I'm looking at it, I see what I expect it to see, not what's actually there. So maybe it's a contraction issue. Maybe it's not even a spelling error. I use the contraction there. There's only like 2 spaces difference between there and they are. So when I go back and I read it, my mind somehow translates there on the paper into expecting to see they are, and I don't catch it. And I'll read through it 5 or 6 times, and the same thing happens. I remember one time in graduate school, I had a spelling error in the first blasted sentence that I had read probably a dozen times, and it was still there. So the problem that you run into is seeing the paper for what it is, not what you want it to be. But there are ways to fix that. All right, now what about a non-timed situation? Basically your essays for homework in here and your research paper. Non-timed situations need a different approach. My first point of advice is write first and edit later. If you focus on getting your words down on the paper. So if you have not written, I'm going to hope that you have written your essay before tonight. But if you have not written your essay rough draft before tonight, the very first thing you should do is just get it down. Write all 500 words. Don't stop to fix stuff. Don't stop to go back and do this or whatever. Because if you start doing that, you lose your focus, you lose your track of what you're doing. So just get it down. You'll fix it later. When you go to fix it, edit like mad. Now, obviously in this case, you are going to be in good shape because this is your rough draft. My advice for you on essays, especially things like your research paper, give at least a week, preferably more, between the time that you have completed your draft and the day it's due. And if that sounds crazy, it gets easier when you do it. And that's one of the reasons, again, why I'm having you turn in your rough draft now and then your actual paper isn't due until next week. The reason this is so important is because you need to walk away from the essay. That's another big thing with your brain. Your brain gets so used to seeing things a certain way and expecting to see things a certain way that if you don't walk away and reset your brain, then you continue to see them the way you expect them to see them. So my advice, get your paper done. Let's say you've got a week. The next day, do absolutely nothing connected to your paper. Preferably do something that de-stresses you. Go for a walk, go see a movie, go read a book on a completely different subject, go out with your friends. I don't care what you do, but do anything but think about your 2BA writing class. That may sound strange because aren't you supposed to obsess over my class? Yeah, of course not. But when you go back to read it and you actually see the paper again next, your brain is going to be fresher and you're going to much more easily see what's actually there. So some people think that they edit. They say they edit, and what they mean is, I finished the paper's due at midnight. I finished the paper at 7 o'clock at night, and then I sat there and read the whole thing over again and again and again and again and again until I turned it in at 11. That is not good editing. I mean, it's better than nothing, but it's not good editing. You want to be able to step away from it. I mean, honestly, even better than a day for your research paper, try to finish it before a holiday or something and give it a week. If it's something that really matters, walk away from it for an extended period and then come back and see it again. But that's also why it's so important to get the full draft done before you walk away. And you'll know what I mean. If your draft is half finished and you walk away for a day, you've forgotten everything that you intended to do. All these things that you were going to say, all this phrasing you were going to put in there, it's all gone. So get it all out and then walk away from it. And then you basically repeat that process ad infinitum, or as many times as you possibly can. So, and it's really not necessarily that bad. If you finish your paper a week ahead of time, you can go back, even if you give 24 hours between each editing session, you can still do 7 drafts of your paper before it's due. And a draft is not anything dramatic. A draft is, I went through the paper and I changed things. So, anyway, please give yourself that margin. Now, some strategies, some actual nitty-gritty. Listen to your work in a text-to-speech application. That is remember I told you I finally found something that worked for me after all these years? That's it. Because when you put it in a text-to-speech application, the computer is going to read to you what is actually on the page, not what you expect to see. And so if you're missing an article, if a word is spelled wrong, if things are incomprehensible, that text-to-speech generator will say it to you, and you'll realize, what the heck was I talking about? What word did I mean to use there? That's also very important because spell check is wonderful, but what do you do when you spelled the word right? It's just the wrong word. What if you meant to say T-H-E-R-E instead of T-H-E-I-R? I think I spelled that right. I have to actually write things down before I spell them right. Maybe you meant to say coal, C-O-L-E, but what you actually put down was cold, C-O-L-D. Well, spell check does not catch those kinds of things. But if you're listening to what you wrote through that text-to-speech generator, it's going to read it out to you and you're going to catch it like that. So do it. There are several of those that you can find online for free. Some that let you choose different voices. If nothing else, use Google Translate. If you put that into the English box of Google Translate and press the button, it will play whatever your text is. Now, Google Translate is limited because it will not let you read 1,000 words. So I don't suggest Google Translate. Take 5 minutes, find one that you like. They're free, but do it. I promise you it'll make a big difference. If you're not going to do that, or maybe do it in addition to it, print your work. I don't know what it is, but seeing something on the page as opposed to seeing it on a screen tends to make people pay attention to it more. Get help. One of the nice things about y'all being in groups, which is very different from the U.S. In the U.S., of course, if I were teaching a class like this, you just have random people who have never met each other before probably, all piled into one room. You all know each other, and you're going to get to know each other even better over the course of the year. Talk to each other and get each other to read each other's essays. Nothing, except for maybe the text-to-speech thing, nothing is better than finding an honest friend who will read your work and give you real good feedback. Now, you have to make sure it is an honest friend. If it's somebody who is, oh, happy, happy, joy, joy, I love the world and I love you, and I could never tell you anything that wouldn't be good, yeah, you don't want that. Star Wars is coming up in December, so I can say this, and I think it will make sense. You want to find someone who will love your essay with the love of the Lord of the Sith. Of course, that's Darth Vader. But anyway, what I mean, of course, is you want to find somebody who will tear your paper apart and tell you every bad thing about it before your professor gets the chance. So do it. Again, that's another one that's hard to overemphasize. Talk to your friends in your group or outside your group and say, I'll read every one of your papers if you'll read every one of mine. It's extra time, but you will see a difference. Don't forget about your footnotes and your bibliography. That's another big one. I find that a lot of people get so focused reading the text of their papers, they forget to look at their notes. Well, notes are important too. So make sure that you give them a look through as well. And then when to stop? Well, really when you get down to it, the best time to stop is when you've run out of time. Other than that, if you find that all you're doing is going through and changing where the commas are, you're probably okay to stop. But if you read through it and you find another spelling error, that means there's probably more to fix. If you find another major grammatical issue, there's probably more to fix. If you're rephrasing an entire paragraph, there's probably more to fix. So as long as you have time, go back and try to catch them. In the end, improving your writing just means lots and lots of hard work. I wish there was a magic button that I could give you to push, a magic pill that you could take. I wish that, I could have done all of this as fun activities. But the truth is, you got to suffer through it. The only way you're going to get any better at writing is write something, find someone who will give you feedback, have them tear it apart, and then fix it. It's hard. And to be honest, if you think you're a good writer, it is very embarrassing. Because the last thing you want to do is spend a whole bunch of time writing what you think is a beautiful piece of prose and then hand it over to someone else and they basically say, hopefully they wouldn't put it quite this way, but what kind of fool wrote this? You made this mistake and you made that mistake and there's all these other problems here. Go back and fix it. It's hard, and that's why a lot of people don't do it. But that's also why a lot of people never get any better as a writer. I know it from my writing. I also know it from experiences with other places. I was building an office once. We used to live up on a mountain, and so I needed a place to do my work. And I had a guy from Maine. He was a Mainer, much older than me, and he had been in construction for years. And so I would do something. I'd run wiring for the outlets, and he'd walk in and he'd look at it and go, "What are you, an idiot? You want this whole place to burn down? You stupid? This all sucks. Tear it out." And honestly, it was hard listening to that. Because you'd spend all your time doing something, you're like, "Yeah, this is great." And then you find out, no, it's really bad. But he was always right. And he always told me how to fix it to where it would become right. And I learned a ton from him, even if I had to listen to him call me an idiot in his Maine accent. So really, do give it a try. Do take it seriously.